Hello, BookTube. We're continuing on with our read-along of Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great, a bestseller that lodged itself on the New York Times bestseller list, and his entry in the suite of books that existed about 10 years ago, railing against organized religion. I'm doing this read-along with David Murphy, and I'll leave a link to his channel down below. We are doing this book chapter by chapter. On all the weekdays. You get the weekends off from us bloviating, but otherwise we've been dissecting it on a fairly minute level for the whole of the month. And we are running out of chapters. Today is the penultimate chapter we have today, and then tomorrow is the conclusion. And then we're done with God is Not Great. And this chapter, today's chapter, is Hitchens sort of consciously wrapping things up. This is chapter 18, and it's called A Finer Tradition, the Resistance of the Rational. And I won't make this a long video because the gist of the chapter is extremely simple. It's Hitchens merely doing a light survey of previous skeptics to organized religion in world history. He picks on people like Socrates or Democritus or Spinoza. Winds up with people like Darwin or Einstein, and gives you a little bit about their life, a little bit about, like, for instance, his beloved Thomas Paine, a little bit about the resistance that they encountered in their day. He echoes a line from both Sam Harris and especially Richard Dawkins in saying that from this vantage point, we don't really know the state of these people's religious beliefs. We know what they had to conform to because, as Hitchens points out and as Dawkins points out, in the ages in which they lived, in the societies in which they lived, you could suffer a lot if you were outspoken in your atheism. You could suffer a lot, including death, dismemberment, death, the ruin of your whole family. Once again, there is a little lack in this chapter of specific historical knowledge. We know, yes, that people like Benjamin Franklin went to church and had a pew and whatnot, even though Franklin was certainly an atheist. We know that people like that. You know, I don't believe, for instance, that anywhere in the Addams family there's ever been anyone who believed in God, and yet it's the references are larded all throughout their public pronouncements and some of their private pronouncements, and they have pews in churches with their names on them and whatnot. And the point, Hitchens is making the point that the societal cost of coming out as an atheist was so great that we don't know how many of these people might have been atheists in their heart because we have only their behavior to go by. And that betrays a somewhat surface understanding, especially of, for instance, the last 300 years, where it is fairly easy to tell. It is, if you go back into, for instance, colonial records for Boston, it's fairly easy to tell. You can pick out the members who obviously had no religious faith. And there wasn't always, except in explicitly theocratic areas or states, there wasn't always a very high price to pay, especially if you were well respected elsewhere. If, like, for instance, the community of Boston would have been perfectly willing for centuries, would have been perfectly willing to sort of quietly look the other way if one of its foremost bankers or shipping magnates was simply not attending church. So, maybe his family went without him, but he never went and never brought it up in conversation. There were ways in most societies to sort of sit that out, unless the society was explicitly and virulently theocratic. The problem with Hitchens' reductions in this chapter is the same in the rest of the book, which is that he seems to look at all of the world's history before himself and think it was all a howling, virulent theocracy, and that isn't exactly true. He comes up with examples even in this chapter of places you could go, places you could grow up, where it wasn't that big a deal, even at the height of religion's power. But he mentions these people, these famous atheists, and you're reading the chapter. I remember I was reading the chapter for the first time, and I was thinking, okay, well, this is uncharacteristically unself-absorbed. you are. This is when you boil the fat off it. This is a very self-absorbed book. Hitchens using himself as a yardstick for everything, and there's nothing quite wrong with that. That is almost a defining characteristic of a polemic. And that's what this is, regardless of what Hitchens fans have said that it's a theological argument of some kind or another, a deep, well-argued historical argument. Is certainly not that. We've seen that in this read-along. It is certainly not that. It's basically a polemic. But even so, even in a polemic, you kind of want the writer to somehow acknowledge that some other people exist. So when I was reading this the first time, I was thinking, okay, well, you're using the famous Isaac Newton turn of phrase that you're standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's great. That's odd that you would be even that close to humble, but it's still great. And then, that first time I got to this passage, and rereading it for this read-along, I got to this passage again. I want to read it to you. When accused of scientific plagiarism, of which he was quite probably guilty, that is absolutely not true, and that was not the context of the quote, but that's okay. Sir Isaac Newton made the guarded admission, which it was itself plagiarized, that he had in his work had the advantage of standing on the shoulders of giants. It would seem only minimally gracious in the first decade of the 21st century to concede the same. Minimal graciousness was just about all anybody ever got from Christopher Hitchens. As and when I wish, I can use a simple laptop to acquaint myself with the life and works of Anaxagoras and Erasmus. Yay, Erasmus, think this is the only mention. Epicurus and Wittgenstein. Not for me, the pouring in the library by candlelight, the shortage of texts, or the difficulties of contact with like-minded persons in other ages and societies. And not for me, except when the telephone rings and I hear hoarse voices condemning me to death, hell, or both. The persistent fear that something I write will lead to the extinction of my work, the exile or worse of my family, the eternal blackening of my name by religious frauds and liars, and the painful choice between recantation and death by torture. I enjoy a freedom and an access of knowledge that would have been unimaginable to the pioneers. Looking back down the perspective of time, I therefore cannot help but notice that the giants upon whom I stand, the giants upon whom I depend, and upon whose massive shoulders I perch, were all of them forced to be a little weak in the crucial and highly and poorly evolved joints of their knees. In other words, he couldn't get through the whole chapter without saying, they all stank except me. He couldn't do it. He had only one chapter to do. It's clearly the point of this chapter is to talk about great atheistic forebears. People in the tradition that he now finds himself. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't get through the whole chapter without saying they were all weak in the knees. Except he mentions Einstein. He mentions Albert Einstein as the one who wasn't. And all the others were. That just boggles my mind. That just boggles my mind. Even knowing to expect it from someone like Hitchens, it boggles my mind. First of all, that he could make such a claim about his own Thomas Paine just mystifies me. Just absolutely mystifies me. That he could invoke the name of Spinoza and say that Spinoza was, on this subject, weak-kneed. Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. Not to mention all of the people that he barely mentions or doesn't mention at all in this book, who literally went to their deaths because they refused to say, there are gods. There are no gods. You're going to kill me unless I say there are? Well, there aren't, so go ahead and kill me. All those people, he knows some of their names, and they don't count. They were weak in the knees. They went to their death for it, and they were weak in the knees. And that's not even to mention the book's most egregious omission. And since we're near the end of the book, I might as well dwell on it just for a moment. If you read God Is Not Great the way we have, chapter by chapter, and if, for instance, like a lot of you are in the position where you haven't read it before, you could easily be forgiven by the time you get to chapter 18 and thinking that no other book like this had been written anywhere in the 21st century. You would have no way of knowing from this book how indebted this book is to Dan Dennett's work, to the God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, and especially to Sam Harris's books, especially to The End of Faith. Oh my God, especially to that. If you did a computer analysis of the two books, that computer would not have much to say that would be nice to Christopher Hitchens. There's no mention of it. Barely a whisper that those books exist. That's bad enough. But what about the traditions those books were built on? Now, granted, those books aren't any better. Okay, Daniel Dennett can be excused because he's mainly dealing with neurology and whatnot. But Richard Dawkins and Samuel Harris know perfectly well they're working in a tradition. They barely even nod at that tradition. It's almost like they don't know anything about it. People like, for instance, Robert Ingersoll, whose name is mentioned, I think, once in this entire book, and who's never quoted. Maimonides is quoted. Thomas Paine is quoted ad nauseum. But Robert Ingersoll, who was Christopher Hitchens of his day, and who wrote beautifully and eloquently and would gladly have died for his belief that there are no gods, I think he's mentioned once. He's never quoted. He's certainly not referred to in this chapter or invoked as a giant on whose shoulders Hitchens perches. And what about Madalyn Murray O'Hair? You can search in vain for her name in this book. Hitchens knew everything that she said. He attended some of her lectures when he was callow and young. He doted on her writing, same as he did on Ingersoll's. He knew these people, and this is the chance for him to acknowledge his debts, and he doesn't do it. And those are just two of 20th century atheists who were voluble, who were vocal. When you read this book, you would think not only has no one ever written a book like this, but no one's ever said these things before. I, alone, have now achieved the courage to do this, despite the fact that I'm getting hoarse-voiced murder threats on the phone. I am the martyr to this whole thing. I am the one who has come forward and said all these things. No, not at all. Not only is Hitchens not the trailblazer, but as we've seen in reading this book, it's not a particularly good example of this kind of book, of this kind of execution case against Christianity. These cases were being made all throughout the 20th century. The thing in the 20th century that really loosened them, that really let them stand on their own and breathe free, was Vatican II, which a lot of divines in the various sects of Christianity, and especially in the Catholic Church, said, we shouldn't do this. It looks on the surface like a giant concession of error. We shouldn't do this at all. And the Pope at the time, God bless him, no pun intended, said, no, I don't care about how other people view it. This is the right thing to do. We want to speak to the people the way our Savior did. You remember him? I think that gave rise to a lot of these things. I think if you look at the publishing history, you'll see that they sort of bump up around the time of Vatican II and after. But even before that, Robert Ingersoll was blazing a trail from one corner of this country to the next. It's a little bit annoying. That's all. We're at the end of the book. I'm not gonna rehearse all of the annoyances that we have here, but it's a little. This chapter is also a little bit wandering. It's a little bit meandering, but it has at least a central purpose, which is to doff the hat to precursors. That's the whole point of this chapter: is to talk about the resistance of rational people, the history of disbelief. And Hitchens, what does he do? He's willing to agree, well, that Socrates may not have existed, but if he did a pretty good job of it. And Newton was a plagiarist, and he stole all of his ideas, but he did a pretty good job of it. And then there's Spinoza and Paine, but I guess I'm retroactively accusing them of sometimes being weak in the knees when it comes to hating religion, to fulminating against organized religion, because I'm not making them my one exception. My one exception is Einstein, and by extension, Hitchens. That's not a bad company to keep in, right? If you're setting the rules, and you say, well, there's Einstein, and there's me. Another famous atheist, another person who wrote voluminously on the subject that Hitchens knew and that he read was, of course, Isaac Asimov, who's, I think if you were to go to the average reader, they might know Asimov's name before they know Hitchens' name, even now. But it was a little bit touching for me to read that mention of Hitchens saying that here in the present day, he is free from the faithful blackening his name. And to remember that there was a book just a couple of years ago called The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, in which an acquaintance of his says exactly that, says exactly the kind of posthumous lie that Hitchens rails against here for Thomas Paine, for Spinoza, for Charles Darwin, which is that at the end he was considering Christianity, that at the end he hadn't given up his faith. A total lie. And not only a total lie, but a lie that Hitchens predicted the faithful would say about him. I don't think he predicted that a friend of his would do it, but he predicted that, I guarantee you that once I'm gone and can't deny it, people will say that I had a deathbed confession of some kind. Don't believe it. I'm telling you that it's not true, and that if they can produce an audio recording, it wasn't me in my right mind. And sure enough, it happened. So you're never quite free from that. But anyway, that is the resistance of the rational. That is the last chapter proper. And the only chapter that we have left to do, the next one we have to do, is the conclusion of the book, chapter 19, which is called The Need for a New Enlightenment. So we will do that next time. And I will be watching David's videos right along with you, because one of the oddities of this read-along is that we're not consulting with each other as to what we want to do or what we want to say or what we want to don't say. So sometimes you'll get us saying the same point. Sometimes you'll get us saying opposite points. I don't know any more than you do until I watch his videos. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, and next time we will finish God is Not Great. So I will close this, but I will see you soon. Thank you, Book Two.